Welcome everybody to Abraham's Whiteboard. For those who do not know me, I'm Jeremy Fricke. I'm Education Director here at Tri-Faith Initiative. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Mughal Empire. While I'm getting my presentation up, how many of you have heard of this, for one?
I'm from India, so we have experienced the both Abrahamic religion, Mughal and the Christian, because they both invaded us and ruled us for many years, many hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
So we experienced that. Okay, I do have more insight about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, my intent is to try to give as nuanced of an understanding of it in a short amount of time as possible. So, all right. All right. So, a couple of announcements. So firstly, for those of you who are able to attend at noon, I believe it's this coming Monday, we're having Crucial Conversations, which is led by Amanda Critchlow Silva. She is going to be helping to lead a conversation about the relationship between sort of civic duties and religion and faith. You know, that'll be very, very heavily focused on going into small groups and having discussions around those topics. But tonight we're here to talk a little bit about the Mughal Empire, and this is intended to really be introductory. You know, we're talking about an over 300-year period that I'm going to be trying to give a decent explanation of kind of the trajectory of it, and open it up for some conversations about how it impacts us today. Now, a couple notes. With anything in history, I am unable to go through every single detail. And the other piece is that there are many, many perspectives. Whenever we're talking about people interacting with other people, there's a lot more complexity than we can clearly explain in 90 minutes. This also continues to affect some of the relations in Pakistan and India today, as well as between the religious groups in that area. But we're going to go through some of the ways that it has influenced things today, as well as going into sort of the context of the founding of the Mughal Empire, go through some of the major emperors, both those who were creating an environment of quite a bit of tolerance, as well as those who were going different directions with their politics. And then we're going to talk about how the Mughal Empire started to kind of lose power and kind of revisit how it is impacting us today. All right, but I do want to start with kind of a broad question that I think any of you are able to discuss here. You know, firstly, what is an empire? And as we know with all human experiences, there's kind of good parts and bad parts. You know, how do we reconcile some of that with these complicated topics like empires? For example, this isn't empire per se, but thinking about like, there's conversations about whether George Washington, for example, is good or bad, right?
It depends what kind of empire. Okay, we are the ruler is. Some ruler are good, some ruler are very bad. Some do exploitation, and some support human nature and everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, also too, what the legacy is left behind. If it's a good legacy, if it's a bad legacy, I mean, that determines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And this is complicated because sometimes those legacies can be different for different people. And we know that from a lot of American history. If we're being honest, that some things worked out really well for some people and not so well for others. And I'm going to try to be as balanced about tonight's topic as possible. Just know that it is more complicated than I can express.
Mhm.
I also just want to mention that, in pop culture, there's a ton of art around the Mughal Empire. And I kind of want to draw particular attention to Anarkali, which has been made into, I don't know, dozens of movies. It's a story of one of the emperors, actually, that will talk about his love interest. His love interest name is Anarkali. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And as we'll talk we'll talk about in a little more detail later, the Mughal Empire's legacy does continue to affect the relations between Pakistan and India today, and in particular between the Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh communities. This history is not that far in the past, and I think it helps us to understand some of the conflict that does happen in that section of the world. So now we're going to go into a little bit of context, because the Mughals can kind of appear as if they come out of nowhere. So the Mughal Empire is an empire that is actually ruled by the minority. So many empires are ruled by one of the larger groups, but the Mughal Empire in particular was ruled by Muslim folks. And even though those that were being ruled in the empire were majority Hindu, but there were many other religious traditions, as well as other Muslims in the area. But this is one situation where the minority was in rule. But we see the Silk Road and many other things that are happening in kind of the medieval era in this area of the world. Many of these things are changing. The Silk Road deteriorating after the Mongols start to split, because the Silk Road was such an integral part of trade for so long. It was trade of goods, it was trade of ideas, it was trade of like where people lived. And under the Mongolian Empire, it was pretty much controlled by one group. So the complexity of navigating was not quite as complicated. And we'll go into the Mongols in a second here. But let's talk a little more context before we go into that. So the Punjab region of basically today, the Punjab takes up a decent portion of Pakistan and a portion of Northwest India. Today, it's the place of many Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus. It's where the majority of Sikhs, which is a religious group, live today. But it has a lot of benefit to anyone who would live there. A lot of this is partially where the Silk Road came through. This is also a land of very fertile soil. There's many resources. So the Punjab is where, to some extent, a large amount of the activities that we're talking about today take place. And I think just keeping that in the back of your mind is important, that this is one small piece of what ends up being the Mughal Empire, but this is kind of a cornerstone. Some other religious movement activities that are happening during this time. We have a rise of the Bhakti Hindu movement, which is a very mystical tradition within Hinduism, a focus on working with the divine through prayer and devotion. We also have Sufi Islam. In my understanding, is at kind of its peak of influence at this time. So we have the mystical traditions of Hinduism as well as Islam peaking right now. And this is also probably the peak of Jainism in this area. So just a tiny bit of context about Jains. They are worth their own hour and a half as well, but they're a tradition that is related to Hinduism, and their priority is to do no harm. Of all teachings, it's to do no harm. So there's a strong emphasis on things like veganism and passive.
And no violence.
Yeah, pacifism, nonviolence, and there's still a community of Jains, everywhere. There's Jains in Omaha. There's Jains all around the world. And then also Sikhism, which is founded just before the Mughal Empire, and it itself is in the context of all of these changes. I just want to mention here that, again, a little bit about Sikhism so that we understand. I know this is going to get a little complicated at first. I'm hoping that it starts to make more sense as we go. But Sikhism is founded during this time by Guru Nanak in a very religiously diverse area. We're talking about Pakistan. We're talking about all these movements happening around. And there's a clear message from Guru Nanak that God is one, and that to some extent Hinduism, Islam, and other religions are related. They are connected to that one experience of God. That's his religion. And eventually it becomes a little more clarified with other gurus, which we'll actually mention a couple other times, other gurus, because the Sikh history is very, very oriented around the Mughal Empire as well. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about various emperors, and there's a sincere possibility that people here know more or different things about a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today, and feel free to pipe in. But we're going to ask a question at the end of this section, and since this is a bigger question, I kind of want you to keep it in the back of your mind. And that's, have you seen people change their attitudes in life? And what do you find leads people to change their opinions, whether it's for better or for worse? Much of the history of any person, let alone any empire, has to do with the way people respond to things that happen around them, right? So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward a little bit. So the first Mughal emperor is Babur, and this piece is very important to understand kind of how the Mughal emperors would have seen themselves in the context of the world and the world's history, because Babur saw himself as the descendant of two major other emperors, and to some extent empires as well. One is Timur, who had the Timurid dynasty, or the Timurid Empire. This was a Muslim empire as well that was mostly a little more north than this, but also was in this area a few generations before, particularly the Punjab region. But the second piece is also Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan, however we'd like to pronounce it. And with the Timurs and Timur himself, there was a strong emphasis on art, science, other forms of culture within the Timurid Empire. One of the more famous scientific discoveries by this was actually some of the first calculations of how the Earth spins properly, like to understand how quickly and how it spins in outer space, to know, that ends up leading to many other discoveries as well. But a lot of people don't know, in particular, that much about Genghis Khan. I think most people think of one thing, or maybe two things, pretty much a bunch of violence and domination of a huge area. In fact, the Mongolian Empire is actually the second largest empire in history. It took up more space than anything except for the British Empire. But the other piece that is really important to know about Genghis Khan, and I find this personally very fascinating, is how intent he was about making sure that there was religious freedom in his empire. And kind of calling back a little bit to both the good and the bad. I mean, there's this complexity of someone who's renowned for violence, but also way ahead of his time on having space for different religions. So I do want to ask if anyone wants to read the quote here, the decree of Genghis Khan and his sons. Would anyone like to read it out loud? I think you're muted, maybe?
Yeah, I got to get used to that. According to the decree of Genghis Khan, which says, may the Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and Muslims be exempt from all taxation, and may they pray to God and continue offering us blessings. I have given this decree to the Shaolin elder to carry it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually this concept of this version, if you will, of religious freedom ends up being adopted by some of the other Mughal emperors. Also, before I move on to the next slide, the Mughal emperors wouldn't have called themselves Mughal emperors. So Mughal is the somewhat Arabic word for Mongol, and it was mostly used by the British, as far as I understand. They would have seen themselves as the continuation of the Timurid Empire. That's how they identified themselves. Now it is a little disconnected, so many historians would make a distinction between those two. But kind of the essence is they see themselves in that way. But they didn't shy away from also seeing themselves as related to Genghis Khan, except that they did reduce the attitude about violence. They didn't want to emphasize the violent piece of Genghis Khan in their rhetoric. So one of the most important battles, and I'm not a huge battle guy, okay, but I do think it's important to know how battles impact sort of the rest of the world and how they impact a lot of social context. Now, the Battle of Panipat, this was kind of the cornerstone fight for Babur. But I know that there were some historians of the time who said that this is actually probably the first time gunpowder was used, that guns were used. They weren't very effective, but the most effective thing that they did was scare the elephants, because this is a time of war elephants, and that would be a lot more effective than the power of guns themselves. He also wrote a very famous autobiography, although I seem to have forgotten the note for that, that is pretty well written. Some of the other emperors are illiterate. He is credited to have written it himself. Now, he does start much of the empire strategy around some level of religious persecution. I think we need to be honest about that. And he saw himself as sort of the continuation of a long history of warfare between very different groups of people. He eventually did end up dying by, sorry, just checking here. He actually died by poison by his own people. They were frustrated with how he handled military conflict. Now, there's a continued underlining of religion and spirituality and mysticism being significant to all these Mughal Empire emperors in different ways. And I want to note here, that they saw their religions very differently themselves, right? So Humayun, who most people would skip over, okay, I'm going to be honest about that. He is considered kind of a weak emperor. He actually loses the small empire that he had and has to go into hiding for 15 years, mostly because he wasn't that interested in military conflict. He wasn't really interested in worrying about violence within the borders. He just kind of wanted to build the interior. And with his fascination of mysticism, he actually oriented his government around the four elements, which many of us know today, earth, fire, water, air, agriculture, military, travel or water, and everything else. I just think that this is particularly fascinating. Now, eventually during his hiatus, he learns how to be a pretty good diplomat. He gains allies, and he comes back and takes the space that he had before, basically. But by and large, he was not very interested in military conflict. Now, Akbar, who is probably the most popular among most groups of people that I've mentioned of the emperors here. Akbar the Great, which Akbar means great, and so his name is basically Great the Great. And so he is so fascinated by religious diversity. But it takes a little bit of a change in his heart, if you will. At first, he actually does start with some level of persecution of non-Muslims, but he actually has a profound religious experience with some Sufis, and then he meets a bunch of other people from different religious backgrounds, and he really dramatically shifts how he rules and how he sees his own religion, really. Now, I don't want to put him on too high of a pedestal. This is an empire. He did double the size of the Mughal Empire. That doesn't usually happen completely by peaceful means. But he did seem to have a deep intention to not create a lower class of people by the people who he's conquering. He had a deep intention to help get marriages across religious lines and ethnic lines, so that there's kind of a, if you're married to the enemy, if you will, then they stop being your enemy. He also had a lot of political attitudes, actually kind of like that Genghis Khan decree that we talked about earlier. Abdul, were you going to say something? Oh, okay. Now this mystical adoption of religion well, actually, we would call it a transtheistic, which basically means faith beyond God. He starts to adopt that sort of attitude. It's sort of, I mean, it's the mystical concepts that I think a lot of people find fascination with. Now, I'm reiterating this about 3 different ways, but he actually adopts the belief that Islam itself not only demands religious tolerance, but really, or that allows religious tolerance, but demands it. That he thinks that it is the priority, one of the biggest priorities of his faith to do that. During Akbar, also a side note, during Akbar, how many of you have heard of the term people of the book in Islam? Yeah. So probably during Akbar, people of the book was expanded to include Hindus during the Mughal Empire, because there is a book, and to be honest, in the context of an empire, it's not going to work to rule people outside of that category. It's just not going to be sustainable from a practical sense. But they were included, as well as Sikhs were also included as people of the book. Now, one thing that I've found particularly fascinating. Now, these are things that to me are like, really, this actually was intended and happened, and they actually put it into place, and they tried these things that I find kind of radical even today. I think Trifaith thinks of the co-location, for example, of the congregations as somewhat radical. He decided that in this context of a whole bunch of religious diversity, he would build the Ibadat Khana. The Ibadat Khana is this building that's in the bottom here, this red building. It's a fairly small building, but the intention of it was actually for interfaith dialogue. He built a building for that. Now, his idea behind interfaith dialogue was more like theological debate as entertainment. So you would have a Jain teacher and a Sikh teacher and a Hindu teacher and a Muslim teacher, and they would all intentionally argue to try to gain some understanding, and to some extent to entertain Akbar and the other nobles. Now, people didn't win or anything, but they were fascinated by these religious philosophies. It's interesting because it appears that Akbar was pretty well versed on religion, but he actually was illiterate. He learned most of what he learned from these kind of debates, these interfaith dialogues that he liked to witness as sort of his passion and his form of entertainment, if you will. I can definitely relate to the whole being invested in interfaith dialogue in that way, that it's not only meaningful, but also it's just fun to hear people agree, disagree, find similarities, differences, find the beauty in each other. I think that was his intention. But this is difficult work. And he eventually did find that the style of interfaith dialogue that he was suggesting did not seem to be working. And he decided to close it down. He didn't give up the hope of religious diversity working together, but he did not use the Ibadat Khana for these theological debates after about 10 years of this. He was so in love with religion. He learned certain ethics from different religious traditions that he decided to adopt for himself, or adopt as part of his politics. One is, he decided to become vegetarian. Now, there's that, I think that's fairly popular around the world for a variety of reasons. But he said that basically Jains helped him to see that. From Hindus, he really loved a lot of the sort of popular religion, if you will, or the prayers and rituals associated with the world around. He also actually did support abstaining from meat on certain holidays. He actually made it a requirement that meat would not be sold during a few major Hindu holidays. And from Christians, he saw chastity as a virtue. He saw this, that some sort of sexual prudence could be a virtue and would be valuable. All right. He's so fascinated by humans, by this kind of shared, this idea of sort of a shared experience of faith and spirituality and mysticism. There are some things that are kind of complicated that I'm not sure how to deal with, and I would love to hear what everyone else thinks about this. So one sort of form of research that he did was he was trying to find the natural language of humans. He believed that people were born with an inherent language. In his view, the animals are born knowing basic language, and humans would too if we wouldn't get in the way and teach our own languages, that there's actually a unifying language underneath everything. And his test was he took a bunch of infants, and they were raised in a home together without any verbal interaction. And of course, at the end of the day, they found that they didn't find any natural language from the experiment, if you will. But I'm conflicted about this, because obviously on one side it's like, wow, he was promoting sort of a universal humanism of sorts, and an understanding of mysticism, and on the other hand, he took a bunch of people's babies and neglected them. But either way, I mean, this is also 500 years ago, so I would love to hear what anyone else thinks about that. Again, I asked the question earlier about like the good and the bad kind of thing.
He allowed Hindu to practice their religion and everything, because he had a Hindu wife, and the Hindu wife gave him the heir. He married numerous times. He married to more than 50 times. But none of them gave him the heir. So the Hindu wife gave him 2 sons. So that is why the Hindu very important to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had many daughters. He had all the daughters, only 2 sons. Only one survived.
Right.
So
yeah,
that is why he respected the Hindu people, and he allowed them no taxes, and they can pray, and he became vegetarian for few days, everything, and he went to the temple also, because he never had heir, son, they want son.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. It's fascinating. Like we can kind of point to a bunch of things. Another theory, if you will, of why he does this is because he doesn't want to be challenged by the religious clerics of the time. That the religious clerics had a lot of political power, and if you spread the power of religious diversity in your community, then you spread the power thinner, so that you are the person who connects everybody, rather than the sort of clergy, if you will. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at this, right? And that's kind of the beautiful thing about history and empires that we can kind of look and figure out, there's a lot of ways that we can look at it.
One
Yep.
more thing, for the kingdom, the son is very important.
Yes, very true.
Because the daughter, okay, they don't have any role in the kingdom.
Right. No, that's very true. And that's not something I know as much about. I really thank you for adding that. I also want to mention again, I'm kind of bringing in some Sikh history. We had Valerie Kaur last October. She's Sikh also, and during Akbar, Akbar visited the Sikh community, and he was really impressed by a lot of their ethics, in particular their main ethical interest of having a fairly peaceful community between Hindus and Muslims. There's a practice in Sikhism called langar, and it's basically a free vegetarian lunch that is for anybody. And you're all supposed to sit on the same level. It's it's intended to be very equal and open to everybody. And he was very impressed by this, so he wanted to gift land to the Sikh guru. And eventually that land ended up becoming the Golden Temple, which is kind of the cornerstone religious building of Sikhism, which is in this picture. Very beautiful building. Right. So Jahangir, after Akbar, there's a lot of different attitudes. Akbar, let me go back here. Akbar reigned for almost 50 years, 49 years. And they were big shoes to fill. We also see a lot of different political changes when new emperors take place. A lot of people want to get in on the action, if you will. That you have a rising class of nobles. You have various religious and political groups that are all interested in figuring out, can we gain something from the new emperor? Now, Jahangir is kind of complicated character. He keeps a few of Akbar's very tolerant attitudes, where he is actually paying for some of the temple's upkeep. I don't believe he gets rid of the tax freedom, but he also is particularly concerned about the rise of Sikhism. And he is also concerned about some of the various Hindu and Jain groups. Sikhism, he finds to be something of a threat to political power. And he ends up executing the fifth Guru Arjan Dev. And this actually causes a pretty big shift in how Sikhs view themselves and their own history, because before this point they are pacifist, and after this point they become open to using violence in defense of themselves. But even though Jahangir had some negative attitudes toward even kind of religious art, like temples, like statues and other things, he collected religious art, and in particular European style Christian art. They say that he particularly loved a panel painting on the Transfiguration. These are not of that. We don't have, as far as I know, we don't have access to those panel paintings anymore, but these are examples of what they might have looked like. So Jahangir is kind of known as being the emperor that moves away from the more tolerant attitude of Akbar, or starts that movement. He also does lose some of the land Akbar gained. Yep, sorry.
See, he had a negative thing about the Hindu religion, but his mother was practicing Hindu. His own mother was practicing Hindu.
Right, right, and it, you know, again, it's complicated because, and we'll see this in as a theme to some extent, that sometimes the same emperor would destroy one temple and build and fund another one for the same religion, and I think a lot of those take very minute details to understand exactly why those decisions were made, but it is fascinating. His attitudes of Hinduism may have been influenced by his relationship with his mom. Who knows? Um, and like I mentioned earlier, Anarkali actually involves Jahangir as primarily a younger person before he becomes emperor. Did you want to add something else?
During his time, the English came, okay, in India,
Yes.
and they reached here to his empire, and they asked for the business approval, and Jahangir say no.
Jahangir said no. I thought he said
First, earlier he said no, but when one of his favorite son, okay, he was the son was ill, so the English, okay, cured him. So then he allowed English in one territory.
right. Yeah. So, and we'll actually go into the. So basically, I'm going to mostly be going through the emperors themselves, and then we're going to go back a little bit to the East Indian Company, because this ends up being a major influence throughout the Mughal Empire from the early part of Jahangir's reign to the end of the Mughal Empire. Really, it's a constant thing that's continuously growing. So, and we're actually going to give a few examples under Shah Jahan, but art is a huge deal. There's a lot of Islamic art. The Islamic art of this time does represent people most of the time. It's kind of Indian and Muslim. You know, the sort of traditional Indian, Hindu, etc., combined with some Muslim ideas about art. So we see some very interesting kind of cosmopolitan style art, and you can see the influence in these pictures. I'm not an art scholar, but you can probably see some of the influence of both basically Hinduism and Islam in many of these paintings. And you'll actually be able to see them in some of the architecture that I'll show also. But Shah Jahan, so he's the fifth Mughal emperor, and he's also very well known primarily for architecture. His big thing was he wanted to build as many things as possible. He loved that. And he's most famous for the Taj Mahal. And I know when I see pictures of it, which we'll show in a second, I always am like, that is much bigger than I remember. That is a big building. It took 10 years to create the mausoleum, and it took another 10 years to create the rest of the environment around the Taj Mahal. They say about 22,000 laborers, 1,000 elephants, and it costs $1 billion. It costed about $1 billion in today's dollars. Now, I want you to note too here the upkeep cost. Now, that seems like a little note, but it actually is very important for the continuance of the Mughal Empire. Shah Jahan loved building things, and he liked to build things that were bigger than necessary, to be completely honest, and expensive to upkeep. They're beautiful, but they're expensive to upkeep. And just the Taj Mahal took the taxes of 20 towns. And that's a lot of taxes being taken for the upkeep of a building and the grounds around it. Here's a couple pictures of the Taj Mahal. I just want to note again that this is a much bigger building than I usually imagine. Um, so this is often seen as sort of the crown jewel uh, of Mughal Empire architecture, and to some extent Mughal Empire art. Um, that there's a lot of themes that this is primarily Islamic, but it does have a lot of influences from sort of traditional Indian art or Hindu art. In particular, now what I'm going to say here is a little controversial. I'm just gonna preface this. So on the top of the Taj Mahal, there's a crescent moon and star, and that's the primary symbol of Islam. But sometimes it's actually understood to be seen. Oh, you have some pictures. um, Thank you. I would love to go sometime. Um, so the topper, if you will, it's primarily a crescent moon and star, but it also does give the appearance actually of the trident of Shiva, actually. Now, was that intentional? I think that's debated. That continues to be debated, because it also is very symmetrical that way. It looks nice, it's a architectural thing, but maybe, maybe it is intended to be both. Yeah.
Top of the all the Mughal building in India, they have influence of the Temple of India. The top, the
Oh,
pinnacle,
yeah.
that they use the metal they use on the top is very much similar to the temples.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
And because he made many palaces, the palaces and buildings and everything, and his son put him in the jail for this because they don't
Yeah.
have any money left,
Yeah. No, it's a big deal for the rest of the Mughal Empire, how much money he spent on beautiful buildings. I'm glad he did. There's always a question about that, but I think it ended up working out today. There's so many people who visit there that I think it probably does bring enough bring enough money in to justify, right? Um, and I also want to show his other kind of big architectural piece, like you said. There's so many buildings that are named after Shah Jahan. Supposedly, he was a major contributor to the designs and all this stuff. That was his pet project. That was his favorite thing. This is called the Shah Jahan Mosque, and it is the mosque with the most domes in the world. It has 93 domes. It's a huge mosque. They say actually, though, that the design of the mosque is set up to where you can hear people from the other side. That it's designed to have the acoustics so that if someone were to, for example, call to prayer, can be heard easily, or just yelling at people, if you need to get them to come over here. The acoustics are supposed to be good enough to send that message all the way across. Now, Aurangzeb, who is mentioned, the son of Shah Jahan, he's kind of seen as the last effective ruler, arguably. He is also probably the most polarizing. And there's the main thing with him is that he does introduce a stronger attitude of persecution again. But he also, it's important to balance a few things, like previously mentioned, the emperor before him just kept building buildings. Some people think that Aurangzeb was, anti-art, anti-architecture for religious reasons, but it appears to me that it is much more about you can't run an empire in the red. You kind of have to make some money. You can't spend it all on architecture. He does bring the Mughal Empire to its largest size. And as I've mentioned before, there's always this continuous complicated attitude toward different religious groups, during the Mughal Empire, both supporting, both persecuting, depending on the geographic region and who's the leader and the time period. You know, there's so much going on here. And just mentioning the Sikh piece of this. So Sikhism really comes into its maturity at this point. Aurangzeb ends up executing the ninth guru, who's the father of the 10th. The 10th is the last one. He does it because there, at this point, we're seeing a lot more conflict between brothers for the emperor seat, right? The guru is vying for a different brother than Aurangzeb, and after Aurangzeb has power, he executes the guru, and Guru Gobind Singh establishes the Khalsa, which is basically today anyway, it's sort of baptized people, baptized Sikhs, if you will. And there's a new duty of defending those who are under attack as part of the Khalsa. And I'll just read this really quick. When all other means have failed, it is just to resort to the use of the sword. Like I mentioned before, there's a theme of Sikhism after seeing a lot of this conflict to move from pacifism to a more what you might call like a warrior sage. That it's sort of a combination between a fighter and a peacemaker. It's a very important concept in Sikhism. Okay, yeah. What would you like?
He was not against the Sikh and the Hindu people only. He was also against the other sect of the Muslim also. He
Yes.
killed his own brother. He killed his own nephews. He put his father in the jail. He put his sister in the jail. He took the gems and jewels. He was not only he was Sunni Musliman, so he supported the Sunni people, but the other people like Khan, Shia, Hindu, Sikh, he was against all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Aurangzeb was the most strict about this, I think, of probably anyone that we've talked about. Yes, and I didn't get a chance to really talk too much about the Shia situation, but most, the entire empire is Sunni, and as you might expect, Akbar was a little more inclusive after his change, and a lot of the attitudes the attitudes toward Hindus and Sikhs are often reflected in the attitudes toward Shia, right? In much of the empire. Now we're going to revisit that question that I asked a little while ago and have some discussion. Have you seen people who have significantly changed their attitudes, and what leads people to change?
Jeremy, I think since we're in our religious discussion area here, I think if people change religions, that's a significant change. So conversions lead to significant changes. And what leads people to do something like that, I think it probably is, has multiple causes. People you meet, people you know, things you learn, and perhaps a lot of passion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Do you believe most people can change? Or maybe I'll switch the question a little bit. Do people change more than they stay the same?
That's a tough one.
I struggle with that one myself.
I was going to say, I think it depends. I've seen people kind of radically change, but then when you dig a little bit deeper, they haven't really changed. Like I know some people from like college who, had maybe a traumatic event or some sort of tragedy happened. And on the surface, it looks like they did like a complete 180. Like, they stopped drinking, they stopped partying. But then if you look a little deeper, it's like they just replaced that with something else. And a lot of times it's like religion or piety. So kind of exchanging one thing for another.
Right. You have a good point.
May I?
Yeah.
Okay. In the modern history, we just experienced few years ago, the guy called Baghdadi, and he persecuted many other sect of the Muslims because he wanted to put the ISIS into the power. So that's all, and it was for the worst, you can say.
Yeah, and he didn't change. Yeah, he didn't change for good, at least.
Yeah, it was not good. He was just only for the one sect of his religion, but he killed so many other innocent people.
Yeah,
and he controlled that area for more than 1 year.
oh, it's interesting. Yeah, that's
Jeremy,
its own. Yeah.
I think people change, but over time, as they see how life and events impact themselves and people they love, they start seeing the end of their life coming near. I think people change their attitudes based on that change in perspective.
Yeah, and I think the running theme, at least to me, of this lesson, this program, is how do we balance the complexity of people and empires, even, right? The good and the bad, whether it's within one person or within a group of people, right? There's a lot of beautiful stuff, and there's a lot of complicated stuff. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the downfall of the Mughal Empire, including a little bit about the British coming in here also. I left that out because I wanted to kind of prioritize the history of the Mughals themselves for a moment. But many people say that there are many reasons why the Mughal Empire starts to fall at this point. And it seems to have a lot to do with having a series of weak leaders that don't seem to know how to balance the priorities of a very diverse nation, diverse empire. That people need different things, and they make a decision that has lasting consequences. For example, the execution of the gurus significantly changed a lot. The Sikhs ended up having their own empire not too long after that, after kind of being inspired to be more political. And as we mentioned before, the rising costs of keeping an empire and not quite figuring out the right way to make enough money to keep everything up. And there's just a series of revolutions that would happen within. Over the next basically century after Aurangzeb, Aurangzeb dies in 1707. Basically, that 18th century is a significant downfall, where we have these puppet leaders that are kind of propped up by nobles, as well as a kind of infamous group called the Syed brothers, who were the ones that were really in power for about, I think, almost a decade and really challenged the authority of the emperor, and once you start kind of whittling a lot of that away, they start to lose the power to govern. But maybe the most influential downfall piece is the British East India Company. Now, all these things kind of have to happen together, right? You invite or are okay with the British East India Company doing trade if you need trade for economic reasons, and it's easier to have bad deals, if you will, if you have weak leaders that are kind of propped up because people want them there rather than because they are good leaders. So I'm just checking all right. But let's talk a little bit about the East India Company and the British colonial period. Now, this is something that I feel like we didn't talk enough about in school. Kind of this, in particular, we have East India Company. There's some other companies that are kind of like this, but East India Company is one of the big ones. So in 1600, it was founded, and it's a corporation. It's a business, and they get a contract pretty much with the British government to do trade for and with others. So they get a deal. Firstly, they get the contract, and then they go to India, and as mentioned before, under Jahangir, they are accepted to do trade in a small area. But they expanded pretty quickly under Jahangir, under the people after Jahangir, and like I said, it's very complicated to govern a diverse, wide-ranging empire. I also want to point out that the East India Company did import people to be used for slave labor, Black people, and used them to kind of use the resources of India and trade it out. Within 100 years, the East India Company was actually able to get the okay to use weaponry alongside their trade from the British government. They're still a corporation here, by the way. They're still not an English or British. They're not government entity. They're a corporation. This is the thing that I didn't really learn until quite a bit later in life, is that this is a business. Okay, I'm going to keep repeating that. This is a business, and they continued to expand, and they got so expansive that they actually were considered to own Bengal, which is a part of India, as well as other parts of India. And they would actually have shareholder meetings to decide the laws of that territory, right? I just find that fascinating. Now, they did that for basically about 2 decades, where this private company made decisions for indigenous people of India through shareholder meetings. And eventually the British were like, I don't really like you doing this, not because of that, but because you have too much power, and I don't like you making us pay as much as you do. So they regulated it and basically forced those policy decisions to be made by the British government. When that started happening, it became harder for the East India Company to make as much money as they did before. And once they got weak enough, the British passed a law that actually absorbed the East India Company as part of the government, took all their holdings, if you will, and now the British own it. And I want to point out, this is this is happening actually kind of in tandem with things like the American colonies, right? Much of this is at the same time. It's not that long ago. So I just think that that's something that we overlook too much. Now, today the Mughal Empire is controversial. It continues to be controversial. The art of the time is considered very beautiful and important. There's so many things that are built that continue to stand. It's complicated, but just to note here that part of the you can see how some of the things that I've mentioned could influence people today. Firstly, right? This isn't that long ago. For example, the easy example is Sikhism, where the gurus, which are basically like prophets, are killed, and that's a central part of their religion at that point. Or in a lot of circles among more nationalistic people, there's an attitude that the Mughals are also colonizers, right? Because they're an empire that comes in, and that the British are an extension of that. So there's kind of this very complicated attitude toward the Mughal Empire. Again, and you've seen and heard a lot of the beauty of the Mughal Empire, the architecture, the science, the art, the many years of religious tolerance, the just fascinating ideas, and a lot of success in governing, especially in the earlier days. But the legacy lives on, and it continues to be relevant for the various issues in the Pakistan-India relations. It probably is influential in some respects to a lot of the conflict that happens between Hindus and Muslims today. Yeah. So, okay, that was a lot of stuff. I want to first ask, does anybody have anything that they want to discuss or any questions they have? I know this was a lot of content. I usually try to have a little more discussion, but it's tough with a topic I assume is pretty new to most people.
Jeremy, I missed the very beginning of this because my computer or internet was not behaving. I apologize. But I was curious what inspired you to teach us about all this.
So the Mughal Empire is a time that is so oriented around religious diversity. It also is part of sort of world history that is relevant to how religious conflict is happening today, as well as a lot of the ideas, particularly among Akbar, in my opinion, is really a fascinating way to see what people did a long time ago in accordance with interfaith dialogue and things like that. It's also a very important time for many Muslims from that area of the world, and as well as the other religious groups there. It also influences a lot of mysticism today as well, because of all that exchange, between different religions, and hearing different ideas that kind of modify how people believe and practice.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, does anyone else see particular applications as to why would I talk about this to an intentionally interfaith audience?
Well, I think a couple things. One, being the tolerance part, because it was, practice. I'm sorry. Was practiced, so long ago. And two, when you look at Akbar, he did a lot of things, and also, trying to, rule at a time where, you had the Sufis, you had the Sikhs, you had Jains, mystics, all like, incubating at the same time. Um, and like, another thing, he did was he had abolished the, religious tax, which is the jizya tax, which at that time, religious, minorities would pay a religious tax, um, which would exempt them from, serving in the military, among other things. So, he was, like an enlightened, ruler at the time, in which, like you said, the history of the Mughal Empire, prior, to him, was more of a violent, nature, under Genghis Khan. So,
Right.
So that now it's, trying to draw like, parallels, with Thai society, back then, with, society now. Are we better off now, as a society, living through, what we did, the past, decade, it seems like, we are regressing, during the past, decade. So,
right.
here's my opinion.
No, I think those are all valid points. Yeah, I want to mention though that although I think Akbar is seen as particularly good, there are many good moments or good parts to to some of the others as well. Like I mentioned before, the ruler before him is not seen as that great because he's not, but that's mostly because he's not interested in conflict. He just doesn't want to do that, and he ends up being pretty good with other religions as well. But he doesn't have the balance that Akbar does to both be a strong governor and a tolerant emperor.
Do you think the acceptance of more interfaith relationships might have helped the people be more peaceful, or might that actually go in the reverse?
Well, I mean, I think, and I would love to hear other people's opinion too. I think that that under Akbar, it's clear that it was highly effective. It's a combination of many things, I'm sure, but I think part of it is his attitude about religion. I mean, that was a seriously important piece, especially during that time. It's always important, but that is how they made the lines between each other at that point. We have a lot of categories that we think about today, and that religious piece is one of the big ones. I think it's very clear that his approach to be not only tolerant but invested in understanding, it's like he's not just saying you have religious freedom. He's saying you have religious freedom, and I'm gonna go check out your celebration. I'm gonna go to your holiday. I'm gonna learn from your teachers, and I'm gonna do all these things. I'm gonna go above and beyond simple tolerance to do it. The rest, I mean, you can argue for their benefits and stuff, but Akbar is the one that is probably the most remembered, period, followed by Shah Jahan because of his architecture.
May I say one more thing?
Yeah.
The Jeremy, as you know, his father Humayun, he was in exile. Okay, he has no empire. Okay, he was going from one place to another place, and his wife was pregnant. So at that time, one Hindu king, they gave him a place to stay in his palace. So the Akbar born in Hindu king palace.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is why
Yeah.
he has to do something for the Hindu people,
No, for
because
sure.
his father has no empire, no place to live. He was wandering from one place to another place to save his life, and wife was pregnant. Think about that. So the Hindu king, they gave them the place to stay in his palace, and there the Akbar was born.
Right.
Yeah.
So his father, who's the who's the one that I was talking about with that
He's
was
a bad luck. He's the bad luck among all Mughal. Bad luck among all Mughal.
Yeah, he does have the worst luck, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's, as far as I read, he seemed like a decent person.
So
for
when the Hindu people they help you, so the Akbar has to do something for the Hindu people as well. And I told you he had a son from the Hindu wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about our own experiences today, I mean, the reasons why we are interested in interfaith work and interfaith dialogue and peacemaking are usually not just one reason, right? It's a collection of life experiences that end up leading us that direction.
And the people say bad thing about the Aurangzeb, that he did very bad thing about Hindu. Not only Hindu, he did the bad thing about Muslims as well.
Yeah.
Own brother, his nephew. He made the barbecue of his own nephew. Think about that, and served it to the father.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it is important to note that and I think this is true in general.
No, sometimes the people taking saying he was against Hindu. Hindu is in the big number in India, but he was not against Hindu only. He was against all his enemies, regardless to their religion and their faith.
Right, and that's why I'm a big believer in, like, we can't have a clear line, of who we're going to be okay with, if we decide to make too much of a line, it basically ends up being either everyone's your enemy or everyone's your friend. And I think, you know what I mean, a lot of relationships, and you can see that in a lot of the emperor attitudes too. You're either a friend of all or you're an enemy to all, and they had to make a decision.
And the last thing about the Aurangzeb, he spent 45 years of his age in the war. He was going north, south, continuously war. And he spent all the money, all the treasure, everything in the war.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely fascinating. Well, I mean, if anyone else has any questions or anything else they would like to discuss, let me know. In the chat, I linked the survey that I would love for you to take if you have time. I would love to know also in the survey, there's some open answer spaces. If you have a particular interest in what you would like to talk about, to learn about, to discuss, please put that in there. I actually do read those surveys, and I do try to involve a lot of the suggestions. So please give us some feedback. Yeah, this is actually there were a lot of options when I was going to go to graduate school for religious studies. This was one thing that I was interested in studying because it's just so beautifully complex, fascinating from a history perspective. And there's just so much more than I can go over during these 60 to 90 minutes, but I hope that you look more into it and maybe watch a Bollywood movie about the Mughal Empire.
The Jodha Akbar is a very good movie. Jodha Akbar.
Is that one actually that's about Akbar's wife, right?
Yeah, the Hindu wife, the Jahangir mom. The Jahangir mom.
Of her entering his household.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that yeah.
You covered. You did a very good presentation. Okay, very good thing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I am so glad you all could come. Thank you for coming. And
in the future, okay, please let us know so we can join again.
Okay, yeah, we'll do. We do this monthly, the first Thursday of the month. I do a whole bunch of different topics. It's usually somewhat history, but not always. Thank you all.